friends. Welcome to Foggy Oak Fairy Tales, a stories podcast for all ages, where we tell farm stories from real life happenings on Foggy Oak Farm, as well as fantasy tales to spark both learning and imagination. I'm so glad you're here. This month's episode is about my parents' black lab, Henry, who we discovered takes an unusual and vast delight in stealing and returning sleds. Not just any sleds, however, only those that he believes are not sleds at all, but actually giant frisbees that it is his very serious responsibility to catch and return to us, even if we are the ones sitting on them. Let's find out how we discovered his amusing habit and enjoy a wintry trip to the past. A few years ago, when my daughters were small, we got a huge snowfall unexpectedly. We get snow every so often in the mountains of Virginia, but not so frequently that a big snow isn't noteworthy. That morning, we woke up to a world covered in a deep blanket of soft, clumpy snow, the perfect kind for snowmen and sledding. We had gotten over a foot in some places, and here that shuts everything down for at least a day and sometimes more. Schools and daycares were closed, and we had two kids who were beside themselves with excitement at the opportunity to do all the snow things they love. The snowmen, making snow ice cream, and most importantly, sledding. We had sleds already, a circular disc style and a small toboggan, both the flimsy light plastic kind you can get at the local hardware store, and they were, as a result, relatively possible for our kids to manage. The disc sled was a deep, shiny blue, and the toboggan a bright orange, both stored amidst a jumble of other seasonal things in the attic. Our farm has a few places that work well for sledding, but no sledding hill can beat the one at my parents' house across the pasture. It is long and sloping, but not too steep, and while there are trees far below at the bottom, there is enough wide open space, carefully maintained by my father, to have a very long sled run before you arrive at any tree trunks. The crest of the hill is just off their front porch, so we trekked our way through the snow, across our pasture, dragging the kids in the toboggan and chattering excitedly about sledding. When we arrived at their porch, we were greeted with a delighted woof and the wildly wagging tail of their black lab, Henry. My parents had only recently retired to the area, and Henry had not been at home the other times we came to sled. His whole body waggled with the motion of his tail as the girls greeted him. "Hi, Henry. Who's a good boy?" Kathy chirped. "Do you want to come sledding with us?" Henry, who has a tendency to groan when he is excited, let out several of them. "All right then, Henry, let's try it," we said as we climbed the steps to the porch and walked along it over to the side that led us to the sledding hill. My parents met us at the door to the porch on the other side of the house, Henry leaping about in front of us as he tried to anticipate our direction. "Henry seems awfully excited," my dad commented as he stepped onto the porch. "He does love the snow," my mom agreed, joining my father on the porch. But none of us had ever realized quite how much Henry loved the snow. Because when we walked down the porch steps on the other side to prepare our sleds at the top of the hill, Henry dashed about in a frenzy, rolling in the snow and woofing at the girls to encourage them to follow him. Kathy, who was carrying the disc sled, laughed and set it down to go to Henry. And that was when Henry noticed her sled. He ran for it, diving headfirst, mouth agape, and seizing it in his jaws, he attempted to trot it over to my dad. It was about as tall as Henry, so it took him some time to figure out how to lever it so that it stuck out past his paws. He still tripped over it, but he gamely grabbed it again and continued his wallowing progress towards my father. "He thinks it's a giant frisbee," my dad laughed as he tried to pull it away from him. "Henry, give," he ordered, and Henry obediently dropped it and stood at rapt attention, just as he did when he desperately wanted you to throw a frisbee for him to retrieve. His eyes were bright, his ears perked, he panted rapidly, and his whole body was rigid with excited tension. "It's not a frisbee, Henry," my dad tried to explain. "Throw it, Kiki!" Kathy squealed in delight. "Oh, why not?" he said, and flicked the disc down the hill exactly as you'd throw a frisbee. The sled sailed down the hill, wobbling a bit, but cutting nicely through the air. And Henry was off like he'd been launched from a cannon, barreling down the hill with leaps and bounds and jumping into the air to catch it just before it landed. Of course, the sled was not truly a frisbee, and he was unprepared for the weight and size of it. So he and the sled tumbled to the ground briefly. Henry was up quickly, though, and without prompting, began ferrying the sled back up the hill, shifting and juggling its position with his mouth so that he was able to walk. Panting, he arrived back at the top of the hill and deposited it in front of an enchanted Kathy, who couldn't decide whether she wanted to throw the disc or sled down. Rory was already working her way down the hill in the toboggan, so Kathy decided to take a spin in the disc as well. She plopped down on the sled, and we helped work her to the edge of the hill, where it began sloping down. Henry, utterly confused as to why Kathy was sitting on his frisbee, darted over and began trying to pull it out from under her. "Henry, stop it. We'll throw it again in a minute," I said with a smile. But Henry was not interested in my opinion. He pulled so hard that he pitched Kathy headfirst into the snow and off the sled, and promptly grabbed the sled and dragged it over to me, tail wagging with pride at recapturing the giant frisbee and depositing it before me. All of us were laughing at his antics, including Kathy, but she did want to sled, so I took the sled from Henry and settled her back onto it. "Henry, with me," my dad called, and Henry reluctantly padded over to him and sat down, clearly yearning with his whole being to reclaim the sled. We sent Kathy down the hill, and in our excitement at watching both of the girls moving down in their sleds, we briefly forgot about Henry. Henry took our inattention as permission to abandon his post and ran off after Kathy, catching up with her about halfway down the hill and beginning to grab and tug at the sled as it moved down, trying to retrieve it from under her yet again. "Henry!" Kathy cackled in delight as he tugged at it. And with a squeal of surprise from Kathy, he again succeeded in dumping her out of the sled. "At least you don't have to carry it back up anymore, Kathy," I called down to her. Kathy and Rory stood together laughing and began helping one another lug the toboggan up the hill as Henry made his way up with his giant prize. Again and again the scene played out. One or both of the girls would slide down the hill, and Henry would catch them and steal the sled, much to their amusement. They were covered in snow, and Henry was beginning to pant more and more heavily after about the 6th attempt. So we started to pack it in to take a break. But Henry looked so longingly at the sled that Kathy took pity on him and flung it as far as she could down the hill. This was, of course, his preferred method of catching the sled. He likes a toss more than a tackle, and he sped after it with all the enthusiasm in the world, failing to catch it in the air, but arriving as it landed and proudly dragging it up the hill where he dropped it and himself at my dad's feet, utterly exhausted. "I think it's time for hot chocolate," my mom declared. We gathered the sleds and the various hats and gloves that had been tossed about during the excitement, deposited them on the porch, and gratefully went inside to warm up and enjoy the hot chocolate that she already had waiting for us. Henry came last of all, recovered enough that it was clear he was hoping for another sled toss. "Come on and take a break too, Henry," my dad told him, beckoning to the open door. Henry, still panting, accepted the command and trotted into the house, where he immediately flopped down on his dog bed to rest. As we warmed up and drank our hot chocolate, we laughed at the memory of Henry pulling the sled right out from under the girls, and at all the fun we'd had sledding and watching his antics, and at how much easier it had been having Henry fetch the sled rather than us. After we'd warmed up a bit, the girls were desperate for a final few sled runs before we headed home. So we donned our layers and tromped back out in the snow, wondering if Henry would join us again. We needn't have wondered that. He scrambled after us, practically vibrating with excitement at getting to catch the sled again. The girls, who were tiring out at this point, only had a handful of runs in them before we decided it was time to head home. Chilled, but filled with the warmth of good times and happy memories, we made our way home to make snow cream, which is a basic frozen treat you make from mixing fresh snow and milk and sugar. As we ate the snow cream, we wondered how long the snow would last and planned to sled again the next day. And we all marveled at Henry's new ability as a sled fetcher, which had saved us a lot of time and effort. We all agreed that the disc sled was much more fun given this new talent of Henry's. He had been totally uninterested in helping to fetch the toboggan up the hill. It did not look like a giant frisbee. And so we agreed that we'd have to get another disc sled at some point. So we did, by a snow or two after that one. And it was a good thing that we had, because the thin plastic of the first disc sled eventually cracked and broke apart from the strain of too many of Henry's fetching sessions. We couldn't complain, though. Henry loved it, and his fetching made sledding a lot easier, even if you did occasionally get dumped into the snow by him as he pulled it right out from under you. Now we know to always have a couple of disc sleds on hand so that, should one break, we have a backup. And while we unfortunately haven't had enough snow yet this year to use my parents' hill, Henry and the rest of us wait with hope for the day we get a few inches at once and are able to bring him his magic giant frisbee for the rare and precious frozen fun that comes with it. The end. It's the holidays here, and I hope those of you who celebrate are having a wonderful holiday season and that all of you are headed into a very happy and fulfilling new year. Until next month. Remember, you're part of the story too. What did you think of this story? What did you imagine when you were listening? We'd love to hear your part of the story. If you and your grown-up want, you can share your thoughts or a picture you drew with our Foggy Oak podcast family. You might find it easiest to share with us on Facebook at Foggy Oak Farm, but we have lots of options on our website, foggyoakfairytales.com. You can also check out pictures from the farm and learn more about us. Thanks for being part of the story, and I hope you'll join us next week.